I'm Dr. Robin Williams, and for today's tour, we're going to visit Savannah City Hall, arguably the most iconic and recognizable building in the city. Opened in January 1906, it has served as Savannah's seat of municipal government for over a century. The building illustrates a fascinating paradox related to the city's famed urban plan. Where do you locate a center of power in a plan conceived for a society of equals that has no logical center, no central square, or singular place of prominence? The answer? You build outside the plan. Located on the north side of Bay Street, Savannah City Hall is actually part of the Savannah waterfront. City Hall illustrates the confidence and ambition of the city in the early 1900s, during a time when cities were struggling with the effects of industrial growth, congestion, pollution, and concerns for social order. In response, cities aimed to reinvent themselves. This effort was called the City Beautiful movement and involved making cities healthier, incorporating new technology, and especially electricity, and beautifying the city with buildings, streets, and public spaces harmoniously designed. Savannah was fortunate, though, in that its urban plan already accomplished some of these goals, with its green spaces and its urban grandeur. In fact, you can see how City Hall closes the vista or view down Bull Street here and faces Johnson Square. The building is designed in the Beaux-Arts classical style that was used for most public buildings as part of the City Beautiful movement. The style is named after the architectural school in Paris, the École des Beaux-Arts, where the style was developed in the 19th century. The City Beautiful movement and the Beaux-Arts classical style were popularized in the United States through the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. City Hall replaced the original City Exchange, which had been erected at the end of the 18th century and was the most venerable and grand early building in the city's history that was still standing around 1900. And yet they were willing to throw away this landmark building in order to build the new City Hall. Standing about a block east of City Hall is a recreation of the original Belfry from the City Exchange that was torn down in 1904 to make room for modern City Hall. Inside this little recreated belfry, though, is the original bell from 1802, believed to be the oldest bell in the state of Georgia. It was imported from Amsterdam in the Netherlands and stood above the city until the early 1900s. Designed by local architect Hyman Wickover, Savannah City Hall reflects key Beaux-Arts classical characteristics. A simple geometric shape for the overall building, in this case a cube, with a symmetrical facade and a very sculptural effect with the central section recessed. Other typical features include the round arches down at the ground level, prominent monumental columns in the middle section, and above them the ornamental statuary, and of course the crowning dome up at the top. Originally, the dome was covered in copper, but in 1987 it was recovered with gold from Dahlonega, Georgia, the site of the nation's first gold rush back in 1829. The gilding of the dome was paid for by local philanthropist Millsby Lane and his Beehive Foundation. It reminds us how much of the public-built environment, especially public monuments, are paid for by private funds. Wickover's design was largely completed, with the notable exception of the elaborate sculpture groups on the roof at each corner depicting ancient chariots, each pulled by 4 horses, known as a quadriga. It may have been inspired by the quadriga sculpted by Daniel Chester French that surmounted one of the buildings at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Join me as we go inside and discover how City Hall combines modernity and the classical tradition to create a bold new civic symbol for Savannah. Appearing in the mosaic pavement of the entrance vestibule is the representation of the City of Savannah's official seal, which depicts an allegory of justice holding a sword and scales set within a temple structure, reflecting the classical origins of Savannah. In the triangular pediment of the temple appears the city's incorporation date of 1789, the year Savannah established its municipal government, and not to be confused with 1733, the year the city itself was established by Oglethorpe. And perhaps most curious to the modern viewer, that single eye in the lower part of the circular frame. This is the Eye of Providence associated with Freemasonry, which appears on the reverse side of the Great Seal of the United States and also on the back of the dollar bill, and evidently inspired Savannah and the state of Colorado, and perhaps others, to incorporate it into their official seal. As you can see above, the mosaic ceiling of the vestibule continues the classical tradition in following ancient Roman patterns, including using mosaics, but in the corners incorporates floral motifs resembling the recent Art Nouveau style. Upon entering the building, one arrives in the circular rotunda. Here we are in City Hall, the center of civic government for the city of Savannah, in a building that was erected in between 1904 and opened to the public on January 1st, 1906. The building replaced the old City Exchange, a venerable building that had occupied the head of Bull Street since the late 18th century. And you might wonder, why would they do this? Well, the building we're about to see was both a symbol of the continuity of civic traditions that the city held dear, as well as a commitment to modernity. So let's explore how this building can be both old and new at the same time. And as one looks up, one sees a series of railings defining the different stories of this four-story space that culminates in a stained glass dome above the rotunda, illuminated both by some sunlight and originally also by electricity. And we can see it has that typical early 20th century, almost Tiffany-like quality with the amber-colored glass and then this milky blue and white glass that has a kind of smoky quality. So stylistically, this is very typical of its time. Now, around the perimeter of each floor, the most striking detail is a series of hanging illuminated globes, the lights that provide the illumination for the space, that hang on the underside of each railing. Now, if you think about it, there's only one source of power that could possibly be used for lights that are hanging upside down. And around 1900, electricity was definitely not your normal kind of source of power, but instead you would have had gas lighting as a much more common way of illuminating. But gas lights cannot hang upside down, the flame has to go up. To us, we take these lights for granted, but in 1900, these would have seemed extraordinary. Another feature of this rotunda space that makes it feel so modern is how the walls gradually curve into the undersides of the railings, a technique known as coving or coved ceilings. In other words, the wall here just curves to that underside. And so I'll pan around so that you can see that the railing actually extends out probably about 4 feet from the wall, but the transition is blurred and basically invisible, giving the illusion that the floors are hovering. And this sense of hovering space, of floating, is an idea or a technique that was particularly popular in modern architecture and gives this building an unusually progressive quality. Well, it's all dressed up in this classical ornament, so it's at the same time both traditional and yet very modern. The floor, with its tile and decorative patterns, is actually quite traditional. And so here again, like the dark stained woodwork and the marble wainscoting, those panels that you can see rising up about the first 5 feet of the walls, is all very traditional. And from the rotunda space, though, our eyes are led to another feature of modernity, the elevator, that stands in its own space, the circulation space at the back of the main floor that we'll explore now. Behind the lobby is probably the most dramatically modern aspect of this building. In its own sort of cubic space is the circulation heart of the building, with a staircase that wraps around the elevator shaft that you see here. So unlike elevators today, which are usually buried in a wall and all we have is a pair of doors that allow us to know where the elevator is, but we really don't think about where the shaft is. We never see the elevator shaft. But in the early days of elevating devices, the idea of bringing the elevator shaft out into the building and making it transparent with this grill so that when an elevator is moving, and I'll see if I can cue an elevator here, just magically conjure up an elevator. Here comes one now. And you can see that the mechanics, you can actually see the elevator cab move and all of its machinery. And this was part of the drama of this new technology, that you could, in fact, the cab originally was also transparent. So when you rode the elevator, you would experience that dramatic sense of movement. This was one of the early elevators in Savannah. There was at least one earlier one in an early bank building, but still in the early 1900s, most Savannahans and most Americans would never have seen an elevator before, let alone ride on one. And so this idea of making this technology at the heart of the building was a dramatic sign of modernity for City Hall. Although the elevator is modern technology, like the rest of this building, the elevator shaft is dressed up in classical Roman ornament. So the grille pattern you see here with its crisscrosses and grid is actually identical to ancient Roman grills that they would put on windows and as security grills on openings. So the style is classical, like this building, but it houses this modern technology. The walls of the circulation space here at the back of City Hall are these two globed lamps that originally were set up so that they could either be powered by electricity, as they are now. Hedging their bets on what the energy of the future would be, these lights were also plumbed with gas. So at the bottom here, you can see there's a valve, and that this part here could have had a flame. So if electricity turned out to be one of those newfangled inventions like the automobile, which they fully expected to just be a fad and disappear, well, they were ready to turn on the lights with gas if it should come back. Well, as we all know, that never happened, but it illustrates just how cautious and uncertain was the future technology in the early 1900s. On the ceiling of the circulation space above the stairwell are these panels, some stained dark and the lower ones having been painted white, little screw heads that give the impression of rivets. And the idea of riveted panels is so distinctive in this corridor here, actually evokes the kind of paneling one would see on virtually every kind of transportation mode, most famously on the sides of ships. So if you were to watch the Titanic movie, you would notice in their recreation that the sides of that ship had all these riveted panels. And although these are screw heads and not rivets, it nonetheless gives the impression of that kind of technology. In addition to building City Hall out of fireproof materials that we've been seeing, like the metal plates on the ceiling that you can see to the left, the building had its own internal fire suppression system with hose hookups on every floor that the fire department could come in and hook up a hose, turn on the valve, and help fight the fire from inside. So this commitment to fireproof construction, and we're going to see later some details like fireproof vaults and fireproof furniture that are integral to the commitment to modernity in this building. As we climb up the stairs to the second floor, with the elevator always to our right here, we re-enter the Rotunda space, and just before we do, we can see how the central frame is a little more elaborate with its classical split pediment detail and nice marble water fountain off to the right. But we come in on access to the Rotunda space. And from here, one could circulate over to the left is the mayor's office. Straight ahead is a conference room, which would lead to the balcony that overlooks Bull Street. And over here to the right, we can enter the council chamber. So one of the interesting things about this building is it follows the Beaux-Arts classical traditions of cross-axial composition, that the most important doorways are going to be either on the straight ahead entry to the back, like we did from the front door to the elevator, and then the cross-axis, which in this case marks the entrance to the council chamber proper. The nice details inside City Hall is that all the doorknobs and plates have the insignia of the city as a decorative feature. Let's now go into the council chamber proper. So follow me. And one of the things that's a little shocking upon coming into the council chamber is how quickly you encounter a fence. There's a railing, a semicircular railing that defines the council space proper, and so you're immediately forced either left or right to basically squeeze past the entrance gate here that leads into the council area. But most people would not come into this area unless they were called to speak. Rather, they would move over to the far left or far right areas, the public seating areas. City Hall would not be possible without being welcomed, at least in this age of restricted access. Thank you to Luciana Spracher, the director of the City of Savannah Archives, who has helped facilitate our visit today. And she is very knowledgeable about the history of the city and probably more knowledgeable about this building than anyone else. And she can help us understand how this space originally was configured. I mentioned the benches just a moment ago, but she quickly reminded me, originally they weren't here. And so I'll let her speak to why that is.
Well, I want to virtually welcome you to City Hall. We'd love to have visitors to City Hall, and I'm sorry you can't be here in person. City Hall is one of my favorite buildings, and I feel very fortunate to work here. The council chamber is the most important room in City Hall. This is where we welcome our citizens to experience city government. However, it's a very different experience than it was when the building opened. We're under a different form of government than we were in 1906 when the building opened. At that time, we were more of a strong mayor form of government. Today, we are a council manager form of government. And in architecture, as you know, form follows function. So the way the room was designed by Hyman Wickover, the architect, followed the type of government that we were under at that time. So when the room and the building opened, the mayor sat on a platform up above. The smaller alderman desks, and these are original, sat in a semicircle facing the mayor with their backs to the public. You had the semicircular railing which separated your council from your public, so a definite division from the government and the public. And then there were no benches, it was standing room only. So you really weren't encouraged to stay very long because it wasn't very comfortable if it was a long meeting. So clearly they were doing business, you were spectators, you were not participants in that process. In the 1950s, city council and city government changed their form of government to the council manager form of government. That was through a change in our charter. And that came through a push from the citizens who felt that the city government wasn't working for them. It wasn't doing what it needed to do. And when we changed our form of government, that's when the desks were flipped around. So all of our city council members were facing the public, became much more interactive. Citizens became participating much more. And over the years, a hodgepodge of seating was brought into the council chambers to provide seating for our citizens to attend meetings. And in the 1980s, we had the benches built for the council chamber.
Just like the rotunda, electric lights are a prominent feature of the city council space. And as we pan around, we can see that the ceiling has a constellation of electric lamps, each filling a coffer or a recessed square in the ceiling. A remarkable number. It almost feels like a theater marquee. There's so many lights. And this was another sign of the kind of modernity that the city was aiming for in the early 1900s, yet balanced with this very traditional, looking at the drapes and the dark stained wood and the classical details that are so distinctive in this space.
In the 1960s, the city staff installed a voting board for the mayor and alderman. On each of their desks, they have this lovely, very 1960s looking voting box. They turn on a light.
We'll see the panel over here on the north wall.
So I'm turning on Alderwoman Lanier's light. Then she can vote yes, or no, or abstain. And then when she's done with her vote, she turns her light off. And this is often, they don't always use the boxes for, or the board as I say, for every vote, but if it is a very important vote or a very controversial vote, an alderman can say, let's go to the board.
So Ms. Spracher, tell us about the how these desks, the council chamber desks, are signs of modernity.
So one of the interesting features about the City Hall project was Hyman Whitcover sort of acted like an interior designer. He developed customized plans for each office that spoke to their specific functions. So we have the original furniture plans that show what furniture was in every single department specific to their function. And the furniture was custom built and it was primarily metal furniture.
And as we can hear,
right? So the alderman's desks here are the original desks. They are faux finished metal on the bottom with just wood tops. And metal was considered to be both more sanitary and fireproof. So one of the things they were trying to do in City Hall was to have the most fireproof building possible, and then also sanitary, which is something we can relate to today in this new environment we're in. And unfortunately, a lot of that furniture sort of dispersed as the city grew and departments moved out. So what you see in the council chamber today is the largest collection of original furniture we still have in one place.
And it's important to remember that City Hall is now entering its 115th year, or maybe 116th year. It opened for business on January 1st, 1906, and here we are in 2020. And this is one of the older city halls that's still functioning in the country. And there have been calls, many cities evolved through multiple city halls. And the fact that this one, there was a proposal a year or two ago by a city manager to move city government to a more modern facility. And there was a public outcry saying, no, City Hall had to stay where it is. And so it's a living building. It has to constantly adjust to changes in technology, changes as the speaker already mentioned in terms of how the seats were reconfigured. In fact, it's kind of ironic that these desks are slightly taller than the mayor's desk, but the mayor's desk originally was the only one on an elevated platform. They're all on an elevated platform now, so the sense of hierarchy is a little bit skewed, but it's part of that ongoing commitment to continuing to use the old features, including these 1960s voting machines that look like little mini IBM computers. And obviously, as times change, the features will change, but there's what they can retain in the past, they do. And that's really one of the wonderful characteristics of this building as it's now into its second century of use. Well, it's my great pleasure to have the opportunity while we're here at City Hall to meet with one of the elected officials from Savannah City Council, Alderman Nick Palumbo from District 4. So, welcome to our video, Nick, and to this tour of City Hall. And what would make it, what's awesome about this is that we get to hear the perspective of someone who sits on council.
So, sitting in the big chair up here, well, it's awesome to be in a historic building like this and the original furniture that was built for this room. So you can see the sitting up in this desk, it's quite an awesome and very powerful feeling sitting up here in the same spot that so many before me have sat to do the business of the city. So in this historic room with all of the original furniture and the light fixtures, and there's so many great, neat details in this council chamber that I just love to show them off anytime that somebody is here. It is not entirely original. There have been some changes, like the drapes that are around each of the windows. Those aren't original, but for the most part, all of the woodwork is still unpainted, and it has its original finish. The hardware is still there. You can see even on the doorknobs, they have the City of Savannah Great Seal. So an enormous amount of TLC and care and planning went into the structure and building of this monumental building on City Hall, right where Oglethorpe landed. So it's an honor to be here.
It is an honor to have you on the tape. You were just mentioning before we started rolling a favorite detail you have at the mayor's desk.
That's right. So if you take a look at the mayor's desk, originally the aldermen were seated at a lower level and then were placed up on this same platform. And we have some modern speaker systems that are here, but the result is that the mayor's seat gets it just about an inch or two lower, which I think that's pretty interesting. And everything here in this room, the design choices are very deliberate. And the other detail that I love is I wonder if Oglethorpe is spinning in his grave because we have a French fleur-de-lis right here on the mayor's seat. If there's any New Orleans Saints fans out there, you'll recognize that. But something that you'd really see in New Orleans or Louisiana is right here in Savannah. And that little tiny brass detail that's put on the mayor's seat to give it that extra oomph in detail. Of course, his seat's a little bit bigger. This is where our clerk of council sits. Our city manager and our city attorney will sit right here. And if any residents come to speak, they also get to speak at a historic podium right here as well. Built for this room, for this building, designed very intentionally to match all together.
So one of the things that concerns me about the future of this building was an idea that was proposed a couple of years ago by a past city manager, but I worry whether it would ever gain traction. And that is the idea of essentially leaving this building for day-to-day business at a minimum, if not completely, and turning into, say, some kind of museum. What do you think about that idea, and what impact does this building have on the perception of government in this city?
Well, for me personally, it would be such a loss to leave this site for city government business. You know, since 1733, when Oglethorpe landed, you know, this is City of Savannah hallowed ground for us. This is where the city exchange was. This is where we built, of course, our city hall where we're standing today. So we've kind of reconsecrated this ground again and again. To leave it would be a remarkable departure, even spiritually, from the city of Savannah to move it somewhere else, because this has always been the heart of the city, and I want to see it stay here. And it goes to show you how quickly things can rapidly evolve and change, where just something totally unthinkable a decade ago has now popped up as this idea. You know, what is the future of City Hall? Is it a functional space? There was an idea where a past city manager thought about turning it into a museum, and that it was maybe more functional that way and bringing visitors in. But the good news is with great structural changes in our city, like we've had an entirely new council and a new mayor, it appears to have gone back to the way that it was, where we've honored and cherished this building, and you'll be able to see some of the restoration that's going on the third floor and the investment that we're taking to stay right here in the building. There are also some more exciting things coming down the pipeline, some real estate actions that I can't divulge just yet, so I'll leave you all in suspense, that reaffirm our commitment to this site as fantastic. The future of Savannah city government.
Oh, that's great news. For all of us who care deeply about the history of the city and the significance of individual landmarks, and as I say at the beginning of this tour, for me, this is the most iconic building, bar none, for the whole city of Savannah. And to leave this building would be in a way to abdicate some of its history And so it's thrilling to hear that the current council believes in that vision too.
Well, I think some of the symbols too that we carry forward as a city throughout time are so critically important. And if you look at all of our police officers, our fire officers, our city government, even if you go to our Wikipedia page, it has as our official seal as the gold dome of City Hall. Even though our official seal is not this building, and it's the scales of justice and the sword of truth, but on all of the badges for each of our police officers in the Savannah Police Department, it has City Hall. The one that everybody knows and recognizes, that that one iconic view of Savannah, you think of our City Hall, and that's kind of remarkable and special. If you think of Paris, France, you're going to think of the Eiffel Tower. If you're thinking of Rome, you're certainly not thinking of their City Hall, but if you think of Savannah, right, one of the first images that comes to mind is our City Hall in this site. So it's so critically important that we care for it. It's given us a great life of over 100 years.
Thank you so much.
So I am standing next to one of the many records vaults that are scattered throughout City Hall. One of the really interesting and I think modern features of the building is that they accounted for record storage. Scattered throughout all of the various departments were record storage for their records, and then also on the upper basement level was a very large permanent records vault. So they were accounting for their archives in 1906, which as an archivist is fascinating to me.
And you were just mentioning that right behind you is a hinge that I can see. So can you tell us about tell us a little bit about these doors? And obviously this is all metal construction.
Right. So it actually was sort of two barriers. So most of them no longer have both sets of doors, but there would have been an outer door, which you can see the nice heavy hinge. And you can see the faux finishing on the hinge there. So it looked like wood to match the wood trim. And then you have a very thick wall, masonry wall here, that's clad in metal, and then an inner door to the vault. And you can see we don't use the locks anymore. Most of them are just supply closets now, but it could be locked up. So you could have two barriers to protect for fire.
Great. So here we have a close-up of the metal work. That's metal. Wood, metal. So the division point being right here. So this is all metal here, including that hinge. And you can see the faux finishing, how elegant and clever they are at doing this and how effective. And it's interesting because this is a tradition that we've seen going back to the Owens Thomas House of faux finishes and the skill it takes to recreate the effect of one material. Although here the motive was completely different. This wasn't to showcase wealth, but rather to allow the modern technology to blend in seamlessly with the traditional materials that would frame the doors. The stained glass dome above the rotunda is actually housed inside the square base of the exterior dome, located just above the main body of City Hall. Narrow windows in this section provide most of the illumination for the glass dome, which is now covered with protective plexiglass. The Rotunda of City Hall is a bit like a museum, and one of the items that we have here is the old machinery from the clock.
These are the original clockworks that were in the clock story, and they connected to the 4 o'clock faces you see on the exterior of City Hall. Originally, there were 4 rods that extended out from the clockworks and connected to the 4 o'clock faces. And there were a series of weights and pulleys that hung down below. And as the clockworks did their work and moved, those 4 arms would turn simultaneously to keep all 4 clock faces at the same exact time. They were also wired to the 2 bells in the cupola, so they would tell the bells when to ring, and they were wired to all of our interior clocks. So these clockworks ran every single timepiece in the building. In the 1940s, they were electrified, and that's when the weight and pulleys were scrapped for scrap metal. And then the 1990s, we went to a digital master controller, and that's when the clockworks were brought down, became a museum piece. And the clockworks, as you see them now, were restored by the local Savannah Tech students with the help of the National Guard. So when City Hall opened in 1906, they put in 2 marble tablets. One was a dedication tablet that said who is involved with the building, and the other was this directory that told you where everything was located in the building. There's some interesting things about this tablet. We like to point it out because it's really a snapshot of what our government was in 1906. There are only 2 offices or spaces in the building that are still in their original locations, the council chamber and the mayor's office on the 2nd floor. Everything else has changed in some way. Most of these functions we still have, but maybe they've evolved. So we still have a city treasurer function, but we now call that the revenue department. That's who you pay your water bill to. We still have the Park and Tree Commission, but as the city grew, we expanded outside of City Hall and they had to move out to near Bull and Victory Drive. There's a few things we don't have anymore though. Like we used to have a health officer on the 3rd floor. This was sort of fascinating. We had a bacteriological lab on the 3rd floor where they would test milk and water and things like that. But in 1919, all health functions shifted to the county because of state law. And so we don't do any health work at all anymore. So that, no more in the city. Another thing that's interesting to me is how they use the building for things. On the 4th floor, you had the harbor master. Perfect view on the 4th floor of what was going on in the river in our harbor. So that was the ideal location for the harbor master. So this is an archival record that's great, carved in stone on our wall on the 1st floor of City Hall.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating to think that this was retained, even though almost all of these functions have moved either out of the building or have ceased, like the health officer has ceased to exist, that the city has this remarkable commitment to preserving the building's heritage. This concludes our visit to City Hall, a building that continues to serve Savannah as its center of government and one of its most iconic civic symbols.